Hello everybody, this is Teacher Eduardo, and in this video lesson we have task 4.1, types of materials, or I should also say types of materials and activities, because it's very difficult if you analyze these characteristics of each, it's very difficult to detach them. Activities contain materials, and materials will lead into activities. So it's really a combination of the two. And what I'll be doing here in this video lesson is mainly setting up the context to facilitate the completion of this task. The completion of this task is basically for you to develop in teams a consultation sheet of types of materials and activities for teaching English to children. Now, to do this, we have to take into account a few other things, and which we'll be reviewing through these sections in this video lesson, and ultimately facilitate our work when lesson planning, when developing the materials, and more importantly, providing a positive impact and a long-lasting impact in our young students. So, okay, let's get started with this video lesson and moving on here to the first topic slide that we have. Learning materials is something that we use constantly in any English class. It's really part of our lesson plans. It's part of the things that we bring to the classroom because consider that in a big way, we're trying to compensate for not being able to go outside to live the situations in the real world. So we use these materials to bring those aspects of real life experience and bring them into the classroom through these visuals, through these activities. So it's really a combination of, like I'm saying, activities and materials, and how we combine them to create those learning experiences, most importantly, with the intention of being long lasting and not just for that specific class or for the exam that might be coming up in a few weeks or next month. So as we're starting to get into the materials, the activities, and the types that they are, it's very important to have some previous considerations to this, just so that we have clear what possible impact these may have on our students. So let's have here, talking about newcomers, people that are just beginning to learn a new language, in our case, English. So we do want to consider that, generally speaking, the visual and auditory materials will be ineffective. Now because we're talking about elementary school, most of these scenarios or most of the kids will be newcomers to the second language, to English. So it is safe to say that to a great extent, to a high percentage, your students, your child students, will not respond completely or completely to an effective degree to visual and auditory materials. Now, the visual material might be a flashcard, might be a poster. So yes, they will see it. Yes, they will react to it in the moment, but it will not necessarily have a long-lasting impact, or it will not necessarily get so what could be here? They will not necessarily respond, so it is meaningful learning, so to speak. Same can be said for auditory. If we're just talking about the language, if we're just giving instruction, but there's no additional elements that support this, then students are just going to listen and they're going to forget almost immediately. So this is very important to keep in mind, that these elements, just by themselves, without any other interactions, they will not necessarily be effective. They will not necessarily provide the learning experience that you might be looking for in your students. What happens here, specifically with children as well, I mean, this could also be applied to adults, but more importantly with children, because also it's their nature. As they're learning something new, they will learn it better if they are tactile and kinesthetic. So basically what this means is that they need to be using their hands, they need to manipulate with their hands, and they need to also be moving with their bodies. So they need to be in constant motion. Now we can also encapsulate this into the verb action. They need to be into action, not just receptive listeners or receptive viewers. They have to be part of the activity and they have to be fully involved. So as you're starting to get into the materials, you always have to be questioning, well, how can I get students to use their hands and to be involved, fully involved? This is something that's really important as you're starting to make choices as to the sort of materials and also the sort of activities. So I'll be handling here both because actually both are applicable. An activity might involve materials, but a material might involve an activity as well. So as we're talking about learning styles, as it is becoming more so apparent here, yes, I mean, we all have these learning styles, we all have these learning preferences, and just because one might be visual, one might be auditive, doesn't mean that they will always be like that. Remember, we all have all learning styles, just to different degrees. And also the condition that we're exposed to will have a big impact. So when talking about children here, the biggest scenario that we need to take into consideration is their nature is already to be involved, to be fully immersed into an experience. So it is, even if they're visual or kinesthetic or visual or auditive, they will normally start at a kinesthetic level. And as they progress and they start to develop confidence and they start to develop efficacy and autonomy in what they're doing, they will start going back into their additional learning preferences, be it visual or auditive. So these are some things that, or this sequence at least, is interesting to have in mind. Again, as you're starting to work with children, as you're beginning a new course, and also as you're introducing a new topic. So you might consider starting at a full kinesthetic or tactile activities or materials that lead into tactile and kinesthetic activities, and then gradually go into the other learning styles. You don't need to have all of their learning preferences in one class. You can extend them through several classes, starting perhaps with a kinesthetic or tactile at the front, and then progressing into the other learning styles. So keep in mind the preferences for learning that students might have, even though they are the basic three here, visual, auditive, and kinesthetic, but also consider that the nature of children will be to be fully immersed. So in the next slides here, we'll take a look at some additional ideas relating to this as we start getting into the context and the background that leads us into identifying the type of materials and then eventually working with these materials and activities to teach English to children. In the previous slide, I was mentioning the importance of having the kinesthetic and the tactile activities up front and then working your way towards the more visual and auditory activities once students have developed confidence and a sense of security in what they're doing with the language. Now, it's also very important and very interesting to have an idea of just what percentage, if we would be able to put a number to it, what is the percentual number or that in relation to the impact that these different materials might have on students' learning. So normally we'll have like readings and posters and songs, and we'll have a variety of materials and activities, and they all have different sort of impacts. It really depends on what you're looking to achieve and which need to be short-term and which need to be long-term, and then decide on the activities and materials accordingly. So for example, here we have here a list of a few items with varying degrees of impact, and I'll start with the ones that have a lower impact here. So for reading, we identify that reading, which will be just, now I'm talking just about the action of reading. So let's say that you give a bit of a reading to your students and you just tell them to read, and that's it. So what that's going to happen is, or the sort of impact that that's going to happen, if we're looking at this not just at the classroom, but more of a mid or long term, this might have a 10% benefit of reading, of impact, meaning they're just going to retain 10% of what they're going to get from the reading, and that's it. Everything else they're going to forget. So reading, to start an activity or a topic with just a reading, as you can see, is not perhaps the best idea. The next one here is listening, which would be this picture over here, the second picture. So just by listening, they will most likely just retain 20% of what they're listening to. 80%, they're going to forget it after the class, by the next day, by the next 2 days, and more specifically by next week. And as time progresses, that percentage could extend possibly to 100% if there is no reinforcement. So just orally giving instructions and having students just listen to you, that you might see that they respond to you at that moment because of the circumstance, the situation, because you're calling their attention. But if you don't have them do something additionally other than just listen, then it's very likely that they will not learn anything. They will retain very little from that. So moving forward now, if we're talking about having students to see, which is our third over here, so let's just put like numbers to these. That would be 1, that would be 2, this would be graphic number 3. So they will only retain around 30% of what they see. Now obviously the visual will have a bit of a more impact because of the nature of colors, the immersion it might imply, but still 30% is very low. So just what does this interpret in relation to material? So if you just have them to watch or see a flashcard, but not do anything else, just watch, they will only retain about 30% of what you show them. If you show them a poster, just to watch it, they will just retain about 30%, give or take. Same if you have any sort of diagrams, visuals, or all these sorts of things where students are just receptive viewers. It's about 30%. And consider that if there is no reinforcement, that 30% will start to diminish over time. The fourth one is talking and discussing, or seeing and discussing more precisely. So that would be this next graphic here, number 4. So now we start to see much more of a long-lasting impact, a much more meaningful impact. And now we're halfway. But notice that to get to this point, we actually need 2 things. We need to have students see something and then talk about it. So you can show a visual and then have them talk about the visual. So that negotiation of meaning, that negotiation of what's visually there and maybe the words and then relating it to Spanish, and that just immersion of looking and talking about something will generate a much better impact, more or less around the middle. So if you plan out 10, talking in more practical terms here perhaps, if you show 10 flashcards and you have them talk about 10 flashcards independently, they will probably remember or have a learning impact about 5 of them, more or less. Again, if there is no reinforcement over time, that 5 could diminish to 4 and 3 and 2 until they ultimately, they might perhaps not never forget fully, but they won't always, but at the same time they will not remember fully, even the portion, no matter how minimal the portion may be, maybe just 1 or 2. But still initially their impact might be around 50%. Again, Notice that we're talking now about two activities. So now they're seeing and they're discussing. Now, if we go all the way, and this is really going mostly all of the way, this one over here, this last image, more or less representative of the best impact that we can have on our students is when they say and they do. So notice how we go here. All of these here at the beginning, the 10%, the 20%, and the 30%, and I'm going to use red for that, right about there, that, and I'm writing here in R because R is more for receptive. They're just receiving information. They're reading, but they're reading perhaps in silence, so that it's receptive. They might have brain activity that goes along with the reading, but that brain activity is also limited to how much they can process and decode the print language. So that it's limited. The listening also, they're receptive. They're just listening, and their comprehension, even though they're receptive physically and mentally, they might be active. Really, that's limited to how much they can decode the auditive or the audible parts of the language. Seeing as well, that might help because you probably have text with a visual, so it's easier, and they already have some life experience, so that might be more accessible. Still, they're just being receptive. It is when we get to these other parts, these last ones, that we start to see a significant impact now, that they start, and we see that it has a meaningful impact because they're being active. They're seeing, and let me just to be color coding here. So the seeing part is a receptive part or a passive part. And let's hear the discussing part is the active part. So they're receiving something, they're being passive about it, and then they're being active about it. Over here, notice that for the 90% to actually be 90, it's what we say. So the say implies, for the say means that you have the prior information. So partially, perhaps, you have the receptive or the passive, but then you also have an action here. And then doing would be fully the action because you already have all of that information. So notice that to have a significant impact with the materials and activities that we have and that we select for our students, most of that has to be action. It has to be doing. It has to be involved, engaged. It's not just, here are the materials. So it's not me like I'm the teacher and I'm just showing you the materials and from your seats you watch and repeat. That would be more of the receptive, passive part. It's more of, here are the flashcards, here you go, touch them, look them, handle them, pass them along, talk about them, do something with them. That is where you're going to get a much better impact, all the way up to 90%. It's very unlikely that you'll get all the way to 100% because there's many things that are going on in the environment, and that would mean that your students are completely focused on you and what they're doing for 100% of the time of the class, and this will just not be the case. But still, the way that you organize the materials and the activities in combination with each other to get students to say, to do, to see, to discuss, that will guarantee that they have a much better impact on learning, that they will have a more long-lasting retention, and it just makes their experience that so much better. With sometimes you could consider even like working with very simple, straightforward material. You've probably identified within the previous slides that it's not just about the materials. It's not just about having a topic and figuring out what material goes with that topic. Really, what's important here is identifying who your students are, how they learn, and what material will best serve that. The material representing the topic that has to be learned for that lesson, for that unit. So it's really about the student at the end, not about the content. So this means that we need to identify the learning styles. Now, you don't need to necessarily have all of the learning styles or consider that you need to involve all of the learning styles consciously in every one of your lessons or in every one of your units or in the entire course perhaps. But what I'm getting at is they don't need to all be happening at the same time, or you don't need to target all of them at the same time, because that could be overwhelming. Perhaps you do one class, but consistently doing class after class for an entire school cycle can be overwhelming. So if you've noticed, what I've been saying is it's better to prioritize how you're going to work the materials in relation to the learning styles, where consider we're working with kids, you put the learning styles that are more kinesthetic to the front. So that means that topic introductions or presentations have to be more kinesthetic in nature. And as you progress, because students are becoming more confident and more competent in working with the language, you start to go off into the auditive and the visuals and combine those as well. So because we're working with materials and learning, and I've been mentioning learning styles within this topic initiation, it's only fair that we take a look at, well, what are those learning styles and what are some of their characteristics? Mainly here, what I mean by characteristics is what those people do or what those people prefer. Now, here's a table, and in this table, you'll see here 4. Now, you're probably accustomed to having only 3, which would be the auditory, the visual, and the kinesthetic. Now, there's a difference here between the tactile and the kinesthetic. Now, both have to do with hands-on, but the tactile, more specifically, is hands-on. So I don't need to be fully engaged, bodily speaking, but just have to work with my hands doing something. So I may be sitting down, but working with Play-Doh, for example. I may be sitting down and cutting and pasting something. So it's really about the hands are the focus here, whereas kinesthetic activities involve the entire body. That means I'm moving. So we go more towards the TPR method here, where they're jumping and running in role playing perhaps. So really that's the difference. So as we're working with topics and we're identifying what materials we can use for our students to have a better impact in their learning, this could be quite convenient to separate the kinesthetic from the tactile. So here you have some short lists for each one of those learning styles. So auditory, here you have a few items here. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see them here on screen. Having questions read to them on a test. So it's not just, so consider your evaluations. If you just provide a printed evaluation, auditory people will have a very difficult time and they will probably not do very well because they need to listen. Their nature is to listen. So reading the questions to them as they go, that could be a very positive thing for them. It gives them more confidence and they capture information better. Participate in oral discussions of written material. So remember, going back to the reading by itself may have a very low impact percentage, just 10%. But if it's reading and talking about something, and the talking implies listening to other people, then that will increase their impact percentage. Visuals here, well, computer graphics, all sorts of charts, organizational charts as well, organizers, working with the chalkboard, not chalkboard anymore, whiteboard, having visuals over there. that is something that they will work with really well. And then here are the list for tactile and kinesthetics. So as I was saying before, drawing, writing, playing board games. Notice that the playing board game is just really working with my hands, my eyes, and my ears. And that's it. So it's not really my entire body. So that's why it's in the tactile department. Making models and diagrams. So again, working with your hands. However, if we go here on the kinesthetic part, now it's playing games that involve their entire body. So running around, playing some kind of sport, perhaps that's a kinesthetic activity. Role playing a song that you're doing, where they're jumping, they're moving. If they're, especially like those animal songs, and they're role playing the animals as they're singing about the animals, that's a kinesthetic activity. You can take that same song and have everybody sit down, and then as they're listening, they could work with material and place it in different sections. So that now it's become a tactile activity with the material. So it depends on how you want to work with that material. Reading chorally with gestures. Again, the gesture part is what makes it kinesthetic. Making models, setting up experiments, and so on and so forth. There you have a few other ideas. So it's very important to identify the learning styles here and their characteristics, what preferences they have of what to do, because that will lead into how you can work with your material, what activities you can develop with your material, and you can target specific learning styles if you have lists like this. So let's say that you're going to present a topic on the family members. Well, let's say that you want to focus first, the introduction will be on this side. I'll just write int right there, and you'll want to go this way as you progress through the lesson. So you start with the kinesthetic or tactile, either way, and as students become more familiar with the vocabulary, with the scenarios, with the dialogues, you start going into the visual and the auditory based lessons. So that means that your initial activities should have to do with playing games, drawing labels, reading chorally, making models and diagrams, playing board games. All these sorts of activities should be around your first few lessons with the topic of family, whatever the content might be. And as you progress in your lessons, you start working more with graphics. These take more of a center stage, where initially these over here were more of a center stage. Then you progress over here. Now I'm not saying that it has to be in this order, but you could go progress into a visual auditory combined or auditory visual. But really that's what the purpose of this is, for you to have an understanding of what these characteristics are and target these characteristics, and then prioritize them across your lessons within your unit. In this short video lesson, I've been talking about not just materials, but if you've noticed, a lot about learning styles, learning preferences, and identifying the materials for those learning preferences. Really, that's the background, because the learning preference represents the actual student. So if we target those learning preferences with the materials, we're actually providing a very positive impact on our students directly. So this task on types of activities, types of materials, we should say it's actually both, because as I mentioned before, a material could lead you to build an activity, but also an activity contains materials that you need to have for the activity to work. Sometimes you'll have a lot of materials, sometimes not so many, but still, materials and activities, they more or less go hand in hand in all of your lessons. So we can work with both of them. Now, the purpose of this task then is to identify the activities and materials that we can use in our classes. Not all of them, because there could just be far too many, but a list that represents the majority, a short list that represents the majority. Now, once we have that, or once you've identified that list, it might be a little different for everybody. There's no standard here, so everybody will more or less generate their own lists. They might be different, they'll be similar, but there will be differences as well, and that's fine. Once you have your lists, what you want to do is you want to start categorizing the materials and activities by similarities and assigning titles to those categories. Now, to better exemplify this, to better illustrate this, I have here something to get you going with. Now, here we have flashcards. Here I have a list of, here I have a list of activities and materials. We have here flashcards. Simon Says. Flashcard would be the material. Simon Says would be an activity. A puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, could be, well, it's material. And a bag with animals would also be material. So here I have 3 materials and 1 activity. So what I want to do here is I want to categorize. But here, I want to show you here something that might happen as well. For example, flashcards. Now, flashcards, you might understand, well, flashcards is a visual. So I'll put it in the category of visual material. And you're correct. However, the way that you work with flashcards could also put flashcards in different categories. For example, in the categories I have here on the screen, you can also talk about card games. You can have small flashcards and get your students to work in teams and do some sort of tactile activity with those flashcards as card games, as a card game. So now what was initially just a visual material has suddenly turned into a card game. So that's what I mean. Notice how, again, not cards, but materials and activities, they go hand in hand. It's very difficult to detach them because one leads into the other and vice versa. So consider that some of these items will be in more than one category, and that's perfectly fine. That's really the purpose of this, for you to identify variations and not just have, well, flashcards are just visuals and that's it. I can't do anything else with them. No, you can actually do a lot of them. And in the more categories that you can put them, because creatively you're identifying different or variations of things that you can do with those, the better. So here, just to exemplify that point, I've put it into in visual materials and card games. Simon Says we could consider it as a game, for example. It could probably fit into other categories as well, but for the ones that I have here, well, we can have it as a game. Puzzles. Puzzles, we could also have it as a game. But, well, I'm not going to put it here visually, but it could also be a card game, depend on the sort of puzzle items that you have. So it really depends on how you work the activity with that material. And finally, bag with animals, well, we could consider that as toys. Toys, if you go to the store, you can buy bags of toys very cheap, and that's your material. So instead of just having a printout, you have an actual miniature toy of the animal, of cars, or anything that you can find, and you work with that with the kids. So you can do tactile activities, you can do, well, it could be visual or it could be auditory activities. Depends on how you work with those toys. But you have it in the toy department. Now these toys could also be in the department of games because you've devised a game with those toys. So again, it really depends on the possibilities that you can see with each of those material and activity items that you identify. And that's really the nature of our task here for identifying types of activities and types of materials. Now, in the list here that I have, let's see here. Now, here I've listed 2 books and 1 website. So in this website will contain a variety of activities and materials that you can work with, and you could take some from there, but more importantly, use it to spark your imagination, and for you, in combination with your team or in collaboration with your team members, to start devising your list of activity and material items. So you just want to brainstorm a list, as many as possible. The more you have, the better. You don't need to get into the extremely long list, but let's say something above 20 items, so that you can get a good variety of categories going. You don't want to just do a list of 5 items and then just end up with 1 or 2 categories, because then you're not diversifying enough. The purpose here is to have enough diversity of items so that you can have a good diversity of categories. The more categories you can have, the more information you'll have available to you when you have to make those choices at the moment of lesson planning. And it'll facilitate your lesson planning greatly. So in this website, this is a blog post. You'll find a lot of information, a lot of lists of items that might be very useful to you. Also, these books here, Crazy Animals and Other Activities for Teaching, as well as games for language learning, you can download from Blackboard. And those are mainly books which are focused only on activities. So there you're going to have very long lists of, and also instructions for all of the activities, which will serve you well in your classes. So you'll have a good repertoire of activities to already work with. You don't have to invent something. It's already there. But what you want to do from those books is go through them with your team and identify materials and some useful activities that you consider like, I can actually work with these activities, and list them, add them to your lists. And also, if you feel it necessary, go onto Google, search for other activities, materials for teaching English, and enrich your list. Once you have a good list going, like you feel confident, like there has a good diversity of activities and materials, then get together with your team and start categorizing, as I have done here on screen. And that's basically it, okay? So just to reiterate here, the task that is to be completed for, or task 4.1, types of materials and activities, is to create a resource sheet where you have a list of activities and materials which are categorized into how you can use them in your classes. So as you're going to be doing this, here I've put a few steps just to help guide you a little more. The first step here is, well, to create your list. Like I had mentioned in the previous slide, create your list of materials and activities for teaching English to children. So you want to consult the resources, the blog, and you want to download the 2 books from Blackboard. Consult that content with your teammates and generate your list of materials and activities. A lot of stuff you're going to get from memory as well, like things you've already used in your classes, the classes that you've already taught. You can talk to other people. You can ask other teachers, well, what sort of materials do you recommend for a class? And materials and activities as well. And they could provide also some input, some valuable input. So try and diversify. Here I'm providing some content, but diversify to other people, to your own experience, and enrich that list of items for materials and activities. So once you've done that, what you want to do is, like I was saying, you want to find themes, find categories in that list, and group those items by categories. Remember, one activity or one material could appear in several categories. It really depends on your approach, on what you can do with that, and how you can create variations in using that material or that activity. So it's perfectly fine that you have one activity or material appear in several categories. And then what you want to do once you have that information, so it's sorted now, it's categorized, you want to create and design a materials consultation sheet. So this is to say that you want to take a document, a blank document, like for example here, what you're seeing here on screen. This would be more or less representative of a letter-sized document or page, and you want to create a consultation sheet right there within just one page. Like I was saying, it has to fit in one page. So it doesn't matter how much content you have, try and work it with your team so it just fits into one page. What you want to do at the end of this is to have a handy consultation paper so that when you're lesson planning, you can either have it open in one tab on your browser or on your word processing application, or maybe you want to print it out and have it handy there right next to you as you're lesson planning. And you have a topic and you need activities because it's the second lesson in the topic. So easily you can go to your sheet here and identify what sort of activities and items and materials you can use for that. So that is greatly going to benefit you and facilitate your lesson planning. And it's also going to create much better classes for your students as well. Okay, and also remember that you'll want to consult. Now here, you'll want to consult the Task 4.1 instructional sheet. And that's all, as you know, in Blackboard in the section of Metas, Unit 4. So here in this video lesson, what I've done is I've just created the contextual scenario to get you going. But really, this is the task to complete here. Okay, so with that, we have concluded this brief video lesson on getting ready for our types of materials and activities task. And as you see, it's not just about the materials and figuring out that, well, on page 75, I have this reading and what can I do with the reading because I'm running out of ideas. It's really about, I have this reading, and these are my students, but this reading, where does it fit in my schedule? Is it the introduction? Well, maybe I want to focus more on a kinesthetic or tactile activity. Is it more down the line to a review part? Well, perhaps just a viewing, a reading and discussing activity. So if you structure your lessons in such a way, you can actually facilitate your lesson planning and you can facilitate the development of activities and materials. And with the reference sheet that you're going to develop for this task, that also in itself is going to help you greatly. So, okay, just remember that once you have concluded this team activity, submit it through Blackboard, and I will be sending feedback also there. All right, till next time.